Okay, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm assuming everyone can see the top slide, and therefore we'll be able to see the rest. So, clinical evaluation of medical devices is a huge topic, and it's also a very, very hot topic. It's the hot potato at the moment. So 15 minutes is only enough to give you a taster. So if we look at the agenda on the next slide, which I am not able to, there we go. This is really, really high level, so please bear with me, and we'll try and have as many questions and answers as possible. And also those of you who will actually be attending the medical device school in November 7th to 9th in London, we will be going into this in a lot more detail there. So that's already the introduction covered. What the second point I put on the agenda was investigation and evaluation. The two often get lumped together, but in fact are very, very different. So I want to be sure that everyone understands what is an investigation and what is an evaluation. Very different. Then I've got a couple of slides on regulations and guidance that hopefully you'll be able to take away with you and look in more detail if you wish to. Then I want to talk about clinical data, because there's a lot of misconceptions, I suppose, about clinical data, because a lot of data that doesn't at face value appear to be clinical is actually of relevance, and the most important thing about your evaluation is building up this total picture that is very much a holistic and cross-functional procedure. So then we'll move on to appraisal of the data. There will be a lot of data there, particularly from literature searches, and that's the one that I'm going to use as an example. You need to appraise that data. Is it worthwhile? Is it not? And why have you disregarded it or not considered it to be so important as other data? And then evaluation, as you'll see, is usually the shortest part of your clinical evaluation. The evaluation itself is more or less a discussion of all the data that you've gathered and appraised. Then we'll just talk a little bit about what goes in a clinical evaluation report. And of course, post-market clinical follow-up is really important. And as PTI have already said, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers at the end, and I gather I'll be seeing some on screen as we go through the webinar. Okay, so let's define investigation and let's define evaluation. So investigation is synonymous with a study or a trial. Clinical investigation is a clinical study, clinical trial. Investigation for medical devices is the correct term, but study and trial are used interchangeably. Trial generally refers to drugs, and study generally refers to pre-market bench testing, biocompatibility testing, that sort of thing. And remember, an investigation is not mandatory, but they are expected for class 3 and active implantables and any device that is claiming some sort of novelty, and we'll come on to equivalence in a few minutes. So investigations can take place pre-market, and very often do take place pre-market, even for class 1 devices, in order to get the CE mark. And this short webinar today is focusing very strongly on Europe. If anyone has any questions about the US or whatever, do ask them at the end. Post-market investigations are there to reduce any identified risk, residual risk, that your post-market surveillance, post-market clinical follow-up has identified. So it's less usual to do a post-market study, but if if additional risks appear from your post-market surveillance, then you may wish to consider doing a post-market investigation. And also mostly post-market investigations are undertaken to extend a label. So you might be extending the intended use, you might be extending the population to which the device is used. Okay, so evaluation happens both pre and post-market and is an ongoing process. It concerns the gathering of data, which may or may not include investigational data. It involves appraisal of that data, as already mentioned. How strong is the data? Is the data relevant? Sorry, I should have said, are the data relevant? And then, of course, evaluating the data that you've gathered and appraised. And this bottom line, notified bodies, I expect some of you will have already met this, but their expectations are now much more stringent than they were even 18 months ago. And the reason for that is probably on the next couple of slides. So we're moving on to regulations, and this slide shows the current regulations. So we've got the Medical Device Directive and the active implantables as well. Oh, and I see I've done a typo there, I do apologise. They were both amended in 2007, in force 3 years later, so we're now 6 years into it. And as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, the new medical device regulations were, or the text for them was published a couple of months ago now, I think. So the current regulations, Annex 1 of the directive, concerns the essential requirements, and 6A of that is must include a clinical evaluation, and then Annex 10 gives you the guidance, or not the guidance, gives you the legal requirements for that clinical evaluation. I'll update this slide and correct that mistake up there. So the new MDR was published, or the text, the consolidated text for it was published a couple of months ago. If anyone wants copies of that, I can always give them out at the Medical Device School. My comment about the notified bodies being increasingly stringent is because part of the MDR concerns the competent authorities being far more vigilant over the notified bodies in seeing what they're doing, and the competent authorities are insisting already that the notified bodies are following the MDRs, even though they aren't formally published, and even though then there will be a 3-year rollout period. But this is what's happening, and fight back as much as manufacturers wish. The notified bodies are shoulder to shoulder on enforcing it now. So the key elements in the new MDRs, which are to be significantly reinforced, or as far as clinical concerned, include clinical investigation, clinical evaluation, vigilance, and post-market surveillance. And these ones, vigilant and PMS, are not always automatically considered in terms of clinical evaluation, but now they're very, very much dovetailed with them. Additionally, risk management and clinical evaluation are now interdependent. So your clinical evaluation must include assessment of risk, and your risk must include assessment of the clinical safety and performance. So interestingly, in the new MDRs, we're now Annex 13 of the MDRs, they are linking post-market clinical follow-up with clinical evaluation. And this annex is divided into part A and B, where A is evaluation, B is post-market clinical follow-up. And we've, the last slide concerns post-market clinical follow-up. So this slide is intended to give guidance. Revision 4 of this MedDev came out at the end of June this year, so it's hot from the press, and I would recommend that each and every one of you gets a copy of that, and it should be able to give you the detail that this webinar doesn't allow time for. And I've put a link here, or you know, copy and paste it, and that will take you not directly to this, but it will take you to a list of all of the European Commission's guidance documents pertaining to medical devices, of which this is one. So they're free and you can download them from there. The notified bodies have been working to revision 4 for over a year now, even though it wasn't published. So that's really what you as manufacturers need to be doing. I've included the GHTF document, even though it's 2007, so even predates version 3 of this one, because it could contain some interesting information for you. And I've also added in on this slide MedDev 2.7, which is about investigations as opposed to evaluations. Just get the next one. Okay, so clinical data. There's a huge amount of clinical data at your fingertips, whether you're aware of it or not. So in addition to sort of clinical investigation data, as already mentioned, risk management is a huge component of this. The medical condition, all of these things are relevant and should be included in your clinical evaluation report. State of the art is a fairly new one and is spelled out in the recent revision 4 of the MedDev just mentioned. So state of the art is your competitors, your previous iteration of your own product, and so on. And it can include alternative treatments, so something that may be a drug, not a device. It can include equivalent devices, which is again another hot topic at the moment. And in terms of equivalence, the European regulators and notified bodies demand that you provide evidence of clinical similarities. Is it used with the same purpose in the same part of the body for the same condition? Are there technical similarities? Does it deliver what it's supposed to deliver in the same time and dose? And biological similarities, which are largely materials and so on, in contact with the same tissue types as in the equivalent device. They're still inviting manufacturers to use equivalence rather than pre-market clinical investigation, but it's very, very tight, and the new MedDev insists that that must be one single predicate or equivalent device rather than previously it was possible to mix and match from other devices. So that's a big difference, which means that manufacturers are more likely to have to do pre-market investigations. Other clinical data, post-market changes to everything we've just mentioned. You will have your own data libraries. It might not be in your department, but there's a lot of know-how in there, and that will include competitors' data, you know, scientific know-how. Remember as well that verification and validation data, and particularly biological evaluation, can be important, and you know, bench testing and so on can be relevant. It's not always, but it can be. So don't dismiss that. Literature search we'll talk more about on a later slide. You'll already have quite a lot of literature in-house, most likely, but is it gathered and is it under your document management system? There are clinical databases out there such as FDA's MAUDE database, clinicaltrials.gov, search MHRA for adverse event reporting, that sort of thing, and recalls. And other FDA databases can be really, really useful. I particularly find their 510K search engine really useful. So if you've got some intelligence about a competitor's product, you can usually, using their 510K database, you can usually, almost without exception, you can find the summary data for their 510K, which is relevant if you're going for EU CE mark nonetheless. Competitor literature, this is a great one. Even if it's like a brochure that they're using, you can quote those in your clinical evaluation reports. Complaint data, very important. For example, if you have received 3 complaints in the last 5 years about a particular device for which you sold 10 million units, and none of those complaints concerned an adverse event for a, a clinical event for a patient, then that is very, very compelling data. And as I've just suggested, excuse my voice, incidences concerning the device and adverse event reports concerning the patient. Not just your own, but your competitors as well. All very valid data. And the important thing is just to keep building up the story throughout your clinical evaluation report. So we've talked about appraisal of data, and I'm going to use a literature search as an example of this. And please know that your literature search must be pre-planned. It can be tweaked along the way, which very often happens. You might go down one route and then decide, oh no, I want to add on another search term or something. It must be systematic. So define upfront before you do anything your search terms. Think about which databases you want to search. Think about the dates that both you need to let the reviewer know the dates upon which you did perform the search, but also the dates if it wasn't like going back forever. So it might be the last 5 years, for example, that you searched for. And I've put PubMed up here because that's a personal favourite, because it covers the whole of sort of biomedical science. Don't forget Google either. Sometimes with a new or innovative device, things haven't yet been published and clinical trials haven't yet been published, but there are data out there and you can find them. So you need to include in this section of your clinical evaluation report the rationale, the methodology, the results, and so on. So I did this earlier this week. So I went into PubMed and I used the term catheter, and I asked for the last 10 years hits, and I got 69,000 returns. Now obviously that is unmanageable. So then what I did was I reduced it to the last 5 years, and I used urinary plus catheter, and I got over 3,000 returns, which is obviously unmanageable as well. So then I added the search term Proteus. Proteus is a bacteria that is associated with urinary tract infections and so on. And I got 66 returns. Great, that was manageable. So I read all 66 of those types and rejected a number because, and these were just examples, there could be more on this list, because they concerned preclinical data that was not relevant to this clinical evaluation, or there were laboratory research, or didn't concern use of a catheter. And then, so having rejected so many, I then read the abstracts of the remainder and rejected some of those because, for example, it was an in vitro model which wasn't relevant to the particular clinical evaluation I was carrying out, and I've put here because they were in the Tibetan language. I mean, sometimes seriously they are in a language that you as the author, particularly for those of us educated in the UK, just wouldn't be able to understand, though you can get them translated and so on. But that's a perfectly good reason for rejecting an article, because you're not in a position to appraise it. And then having appraised those, get full copies of the remainder. This is really, really important, because, as you know, abstracts do not always contain the information that you're really trying to dig out, and the notified body reviewer wants to know, and they usually want to see, the full copy of every single article. So we come on to the evaluation and the report. And as I said earlier, evaluation is essentially the discussion of all the data that you've presented. And we've been through some of that already on this webinar. I've put up here an example table of contents. So we've got the regulatory history, product description, intended use. Remember that your clinical evaluation report needs to be a standalone document, because very often the reviewer will not be the same as the technical reviewer for the rest of your technical file or design dossier. Remember, state of the art is now required, and you may find that some of your, if you're using predicates, sorry, the equivalent argument, that some of these will be duplicated here in substantial equivalence. Biological evaluation feeds into clinical safety, and then you've got your literature review. Clinical experience, are you already on market? What experience do you have? So that's sort of your post-market stuff. But don't forget clinical experience from competitor devices as well. It's all relevant. Okay, I know I'm running a bit late, but I think this is probably the last slide. So post-market clinical follow-up is also a very hot topic and is often misunderstood in the same way as investigation versus evaluation can be misunderstood. So post-market clinical follow-up is a continuum of your pre-market clinical evaluation. It's a continuous process to update the clinical evaluation, and what it does is it drives revisions of your clinical evaluation report. And interestingly, sorry, I've copied and pasted this from the new medical device regulation, which are being insisted upon already by the notified bodies and competent authorities. So post-market clinical follow-up is part of your PMS SOP. And the requirement is that you will proactively collect, evaluate clinical data. So it's an ongoing procedure from you know, pre-market. The aim of it is to confirm the safety and performance and the acceptability of identified risks, and importantly to detect emerging risks. And you need to have a post-market clinical follow-up plan, which as previously stated is part of your post-market surveillance procedure.